welcome to the second annual Equity, Diversity and Belonging lecture, which we call the EDB lecture. My name is Heath Rose, and I'm here in my capacity as co-chair for the EDB committee, alongside Debbie Aiken, who's just checking people can get through the door. Before I introduce the speaker, I wanted to say a few words about the EDB work within the department. So the Department of Education, like most departments, is committed to enhancing diversity and promoting equality and inclusion among all staff and students. But that being said, as people who research educational systems, this commitment extends to our study of various educational contexts, both within the UK and around the world. And so the timing of today's lecture dovetails with a lot of efforts of our colleagues within the department to bring issues of race and coloniality to the foreground of discussions of educational research. Most recently, we saw this in the form of a public seminar series on the theme of imperial legacies, race and education, which ran in the first term of this academic year. And so if you missed out on that seminar series, some of the lectures are available recorded via our department website. So as educators ourselves, we know that education is at the heart of change, of systematic change. And many of us are working to remove barriers to equality in educational systems. So we are developing a working and learning and social space where individual rights and the dignity of all members are respected. And as educators, we know that there's still a lot to work within the educational systems that we work within and that we study. So we have a long way to go to minimize barriers to equality and to create equitable learning spaces for all. So engaging in public discussions, as our plenary speaker will do today, is an important first step in achieving social change. So Arathi Sriprakash is a professor of education at the University of Bristol. Arathi is primarily a sociologist of education. Let's keep politics out of this for now. Whose work focuses on the racial politics of knowledge, particularly in the field of education and international development. She examines the politics of education reform in the Indian and Australian contexts, as well as the global governance of childhood and the family. So underlying this work has been an abiding interest in politics of knowledge. And so this has led Arathi to explore the contested science of education in international development, as well as the active erasures of racism and coloniality in the field of education. So ongoing questions about the relationship between epistemic justice and racial justice in education sustain her current thinking, research, and teaching. So she is co-author of Learning Whiteness, Education, the Settler Colonial State, which you can see here and there, and co-director of the Center for Comparative and International Research in Education. And so you can look at this work there. I think this is quite recently produced work. Arathi's work on reparative futures fed into UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative, and she is soon to commence a large empirical study on this theme. So in her previous post as reader at Cambridge University and in her current post as professor at Bristol, Arathi's scholarship has had global reach. She has quickly become a leading voice for research on studies of race, coloniality, and educational development. And she works across multiple sectors of education, including early childhood research to higher education policy. She's a highly accomplished scholar, and she has an impressive grant record, and is currently the PI on a £2 million ERC consolidated grant, which starts this year. And for those of us who are aware of these consolidated grants, we know that they are highly competitive and speak volumes to the abilities and the profiles of researchers who receive them. And so we're very happy that Arathi has taken time out of her busy schedule to talk to us about this important topic today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Heath and Debbie, for organising this event and inviting me along to it, as well as all the hospitality shown by the departmental colleagues here. So that was a very kind introduction. I have to recover from it. So it's I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about some of my new work that you mentioned, Heath, that is thinking through this idea of reparative futures. And what I'd like to share with you today is somewhat early thinking about this, but also trying to reflect on what the implications might be for how we do equity, diversity and belonging work in institutions, perhaps such as this one. So I'm working with this idea of reparations because I think that it offers something really important for addressing educational injustices. Now, we do know that the idea of reparations has gained some quite a bit of profile in recent years in public debate, certainly emerging from really important and long-standing social movements. And I think, it is now part of public discourse. We start to see, perhaps those of you who are aware, The Guardian recently released some, research into its entanglements with the transatlantic slave trade, which has then opened up really important conversations about what its responsibility is as an institution. We're seeing those sorts of conversations happen in various institutions, including universities. So I know that Bristol, where I'm based, is similarly having that conversation. Cambridge, where I was, also, and it would be useful to know what kinds of conversations are happening in Oxford too. So perhaps we can have that conversation in the Q&A session. Now, what brings me to this idea of reparation? Well, I'm drawn to it because it requires us to understand the interconnections between past, present, and futures, not only in the formation of injustice, but also its repair. That is, we can't think about moving beyond a state of inequality or injustice without thinking about how those injustices might be embedded through time, right? So that interlinkage between past, present, future is really central to the idea of reparation. And it's central because reparations, the idea implies that until injustices are actively addressed, they can endure in social institutions, such as universities, which also shape lives to come, right? So there's an intergenerational or future-facing consequence to this idea. So this leads us to questions such as how might reparative frameworks create different kinds of futures for education? And how might reparative frameworks help us address matters of equity, diversity, and belonging in which we're engaged with? So those are the kinds of questions I'll be thinking about today with you. So before I begin and thinking about some of the remarks that Heath made about my academic background, I thought I would give you a bit of context of how I've arrived to some of these questions and inspirations really for drawing on the idea of reparative justice and reparation. So as Heath mentioned, I'm a sociologist of education, and I was trained early in my career in what was then called the new sociology of education, which was not very new, not new at the moment anymore. I've moved on, but key thinkers in this field might be recognisable to you: Basil Bernstein, Pierre Bourdieu, amongst others, who made really important contributions for opening up the so-called black box of schooling to understand the ways in which social hierarchies are reproduced through curriculum, pedagogy, and so on, right? This work was really powerful in demonstrating the reproduction of the social order, okay? So we often think about this work as showing us, in really clear-sighted ways how education can be a vehicle for social reproduction. Now, this work is really hugely powerful and important, and it reveals the constitutive inequalities of education, the structural injustices of education. However, over the years I've been grappling with what I've come to see as the social and temporal determinism of some strands of this work that I myself have undertaken. So it's also a lesson in being really reflexive about how ideas change over time as well as a scholar. Thinking about this determinism, social and temporal determinism, that's the idea that education so the idea of education in that work, or the assumption perhaps, is that it inevitably reproduces social inequities, and so therefore the future is also a story of reproduction rather than of change. So it wasn't until I began to work much more squarely in the field of racial justice in education over the last decade or so that I began to see how the rich theorising of social movement theory, indigenous knowledges and black thought have offered a steadfast critique of structural injustices in education, whilst also having a clear-eyed view on creating a different kind of society and a different kind of future. So I felt that this kind of work was really trying to challenge the determinism that I'd begun to see so much in that old/new sociology of education. And I just want to point, up on the slides, but also here, to works that have come out fairly recently. These are both collaborative projects that you're welcome to come and have a look at, or maybe ask me about a bit later. But the special issue in the journal Comparative Education Review is called Black Lives Matter and the Global Struggles for Racial Justice in Education, and it brings together, I think, such incredible work by scholars from across the globe, working with BLM social movement theory and thinking about its significance for transforming education in contexts such as South Africa, Liberia, Brazil, Australia, the US, and so on. So, it's a collection that's global in scope, and that was only possible through ongoing deep collaborations with a really large group of people. So I think even the compilation of that issue itself was an act of solidarity and reaching out across contexts. The other book is Learning Whiteness, which Heath kindly mentioned, and that's a project that a book that I wrote with Sophie Rudolph and Jessica Gerard, and it looks at the relationship between education and the settler colonial state in Australia, and thinking about whiteness as an organising principle in mostly school education, though we do have some case studies of higher education as well. And it was through really grounding the work in theories of Indigenous sovereignty and working with the theories of Indigenous scholars in Australia that we were, as I mentioned before, able to break out of the determinism, I think, that I mentioned, and think about futures that did centre Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous futures. So I just want to point you to those works as where I think where my own sort of academic and perhaps political grounding has taken place for this current work on reparations. So, reparations. As I mentioned, it's an idea that really foregrounds the interconnections between past, present, and future. We are seeing somewhat of a reparative turn, if you like, in the social sciences and humanities. There hasn't really been that much written about this recently in education, so that's certainly a project that I'm trying to undertake. And I've put up here a few of the key books that I've been thinking with in that project. And one of them is Reconsidering Reparations by Olufemi Otaiwo. And he makes a really important point. He says that reparative thinking is actually a future-making and action-oriented approach. And he's very clear in making this point because it's a response to a common critique of reparations, reparative justice, as being backward, too focused in the past. It's backward-looking. We need to move on, right? So that's a common critique that was, and we can hear that sort of critique in public discourse. But Taiwo's argument is actually that reparations has the ability to construct new worlds, right? It is future-facing. It can remake social relations. So actually, it's not backward-looking at all. It's future-facing. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of its significance for thinking about reparative futures. What would it mean to construct a future of education that addressed the injustices of past and present? And that's what I'm trying to understand as reparative futures of education. Now, the other critique of reparations is that it's about fixing a broken system, so repairing something that is broken, so therefore we just need to go back to the past to fix it, and then and it will be whole again. But actually, looking at Vanessa Oliveira's work on hospicing modernity, she writes that that kind of reconstructive agenda doesn't always have to mean an act of repair, as if we ought to go back to some sort of imagined wholeness. Actually, it might mean that we need to hospice or abolish certain norms and institutions or practices, actually step away from those rather than undertake an action of repair. So there's some conceptual moves that Vanessa Oliveira is making in that work, but it's a response, I think, that's quite useful for us, because there are some things in education that we might not want to save or keep. We might want to support the hospicing of those ideas. And finally, the last point draws on Michelle Bishop's work, an Indigenous scholar in Australia, who really emphasises the intergenerational consequences of reparative thinking and brings that into thinking about how important education is intergenerationally as well. And so I think that conceptually, as a sociologist, I do see that there are strong links to be made between a reparative agenda and what we are, many of us here are educators, what we are trying to do in education as well. So I think there are some really important synergies that ought to be explored a bit more. Just a quick note on, so far I've been speaking in very broad terms about reparations, and we perhaps ought to think about, well, reparations for what? Now, lots of the social movements where reparations agendas have really emerged from, and I want to honour those, that these are ideas that have not merely come from up on high, from the ivory towers of academia, but are certainly rooted in long-standing struggles for justice by communities who have experienced historical state colonial violence, particularly around enslavement, land theft, dispossession, and exploitation. So this has historically been where the reparations debate has been located. But when I talk about these violences as historical violences, there's an important point to be made. In fact, this is made clear by those who are leading these social movements, that history is not over. Right? History is not just in the past. There are contemporary formations, or what we might understand as afterlives of historical violence. And we can understand the structural injustices of today, of education systems today, as an expression of some of those histories of violence. So this then, as educators, begs the question we need to ask ourselves, what has been the role of education institutions in sustaining those formations, those structural injustices? Okay, and that again gets us back to the central point about reparations, creating those interconnections between past, present, and future. How has our present today been shaped by those historical legacies, and then what is our responsibility for the future? Okay, so making those interconnections. And it's here where I'm thinking, and really thinking aloud. It'd be great to have conversations with folk here about, what would it mean to frame EDB work around these questions of reparative justice, and be useful to know how far people are thinking about it in those terms. So, what did I want to say here? So, in terms of just giving you a bit of the other sort of intellectual grounding to this work, I've been working a bit with the ideas of Iris Marion Young, who's a philosopher, political theorist, who has written about structural injustices, and particularly a book called Responsibility for Justice, which brings in this framework of who is responsible for justice. And extending her work, she doesn't write on education per se, but extending her work into the education domain, we can understand educational injustice as a moral wrong, and this is then extending Young's work. It's a moral wrong that occurs as a consequence of social, political, and economic processes. That is, it's not a natural state of being. And it is one, it's a state, it's a process that are features of the arrangements around us. So once we are identifying those injustices, then this also brings up questions of what are we going to do about it. And this harks back to Olufemi Taiwo's idea that a reparative lens is both future-facing but action-oriented. It is always foregrounding the point of action. What are we meant to do about it? And so that's what that second point makes. A reparative lens recognises the structural nature of educational injustices and opens up questions about our collective responsibility. Okay, it's action-oriented. And I think here you start to see, this is also links back to my departure from the new sociology of education, which certainly did the first part, recognising the structural nature of educational injustice, but perhaps I felt too often left it at that. And I think that the reparative work that's been led by communities on the ground is actually giving us some guideposts, I think, for a different kind of engagement. And indeed, as Heath mentioned, some of this thinking has informed the UNESCO Futures of Education initiative, and right on I think the opening page of the 2021 report, Futures of Education report, UNESCO says we need a new social contract for education to repair injustices whilst transforming the future. So there is certainly a kind of global recognition, I think, of some of these ideas. How this plays out in practice, indeed what a new social contract looks like, I think are all things that are for sure contested and things that we can debate. Okay, so what I wanted to do in the next few slides is map out some, again, really early thinking around, how we might use the lens of reparative justice to think about reframing EDB work. And this is drawing from a recent paper of mine. I've put the citation there, called Reparations, Theorising Just Futures of Education. And what I'm going to sketch out, and these are not the only dimensions, but I'm going to sketch out 3 dimensions of reparations that we might think with to address the injustices that we can recognise in education. So thinking about material reparations, pedagogic reparations, and epistemic reparations. Okay, so material reparations, what would this look like? One of the things I've been thinking about is, particularly in terms of transitional justice, the idea of reparation is often at an individual level or perhaps at a group level to offer material redress for those who are particularly harmed by a human rights abuse or so on. Now, that works at an individual level, but for education, if we're thinking at a structural level, the idea is what kinds of material redress are needed in an education system so that future children, if we're thinking at school level, are not harmed or not facing injustice in an education system. So it's not so much about fixing the injustices of a past student, but thinking about what we can do in an education system to guard against harms or injustices for the future. So that's a structural position. Okay? And that requires us to recognise the moral depths of past and present injustice to ensure their redress and non-recurrence. Okay, so that this is about systemic structural reform. It might seem very, these are questions that are difficult. Obviously, they require quite radical transformation of the political and economic systems that indeed our education systems turn on. They absolutely foreground questions of distributive justice, but I do think they are absolutely questions we ought to still have and ask. And in some ways, we see that places are starting to to really think about this, even at institutional levels. I mentioned before about universities who are undertaking work around, having done inquiries into their role in the transatlantic slave trade. There are now questions about, okay, how do we reckon with this? How do we think about the distribution of resources now? And I think that is a live question. Institutions like Glasgow are, setting up funds, creating partnerships with universities overseas and so on to try to think about this work in a material sense. I'm actually part of a project at UCL, which had recently completed its inquiry into its entanglements with eugenics, and there's similarly a conversation there, right? And so I think there is a material dimension to redress in that context too. Okay, so material reparations is one dimension of reparative justice in education. The second, and one that perhaps is, I think one that is certainly within the reach of educators, and I think this is why it is so powerful, is this idea of epistemic repair. Here I've been thinking with the philosopher Charles Mills, whose work on ignorance, the epistemology of ignorance. If anyone has, there is actually a reading list at the end, so I can share that with you. It's, I think it's work that really expanded my thinking about the politics of knowledge. Mills draws our attention to the structural character of epistemic injustice, and what by that it's that the erasures or the ignorances around certain kinds of knowledges are not simply absences or gaps in our understanding, but there is a structural there's what he calls a cognitive economy that has allowed us to not know. And to give you a very simple example, so I was born and brought up in Australia, grew up there all my schooling life, and I don't speak any Indigenous language. Now that's not by accident. That's because there are a set, a very I would say deliberate set of policy, educational, social, political decisions, right? And so this is what Mills talks about as the cognitive economy that sustains ignorance, that sustains epistemic injustice. So thinking then about the idea of epistemic repair, this might be oriented towards interrogating past and present epistemic injustices, refusing to carry them forward, carry forward their erasures, denials and distortions, precisely by attending to them through our educational systems, institutions and practices. And this is, if you're teachers, educators in the room, I think this is where we do have a lot of power to address some of this. There is a new book that's been released, and I haven't managed to get my hands on it yet because I think it's only been published in the US and it's soon to come out in the UK. It's by Ariana Gonzalez-Stokes and it's called Reparative Universities, Why Diversity Alone Will Not Solve Racism in Higher Ed. And in that, she does, I believe, just from the small bits that I've seen, expand on this idea of epistemic repair, defining it as an effort to shift ways of knowing and being in the present in order to perceive and atone for the persistence of the past. So I think from what my understanding of this book, I think it will be quite a significant volume for us to think about sort of EDI work in universities beyond the kind of arguably kind of token additions of this and that, and rather really trying to think about it through a reparative lens. So I'm quite excited about the release of that volume. And finally, thinking about the idea of reparative pedagogy. So in this framework, just to give you a recap, we've had material reparations, epistemic reparations, and then finally this idea of reparative pedagogies. And I think this is actually, again, really crucial for us as educators. And it, collective recognition and of injustices and building shared meanings of it is actually at the heart of reparative justice. But building understanding is also at the heart of education, right? And I think, the idea of reparative pedagogies, this idea of fostering dialogue, creating meaning together, creating new understandings and new imaginations of social possibilities is absolutely, this is where there is some really powerful literature from within education that has been trying to do this work. And I think there's a lot to be said for us to think really seriously about how our institutions, how universities are engaged with reparative pedagogies. How do we enact these in our classes? And I was really struck by, again, another political theorist, Ali Aslam, who recently was writing about the praxis of repair. And he writes, the repair of injustice can be thought of as a praxis through which new norms, relations, and institutions can be made, creating with others an expanded political imagination. And when I read that, I thought, well, gee, that sounds like really good education. That to me is what education is. So again, I'll put the reference up at the end, and you can read into his work, which again I should say comes out of social movement organising, BLM organising. So he's theorising ideas of community mobilisation. Okay, so far I've been talking in terms that are fairly abstract, certainly drawing on theories. I have hunches about the power of reparative frameworks, but what does this all look like actually in practice? I don't know yet, but I hope to find out, and I hope that I can stand here in 5 years and tell you, because as he mentioned, I'm about to embark on this big new project, which is called Reparative Futures of Education. And I'm not going to be, the study doesn't focus on higher education, but actually on primary schooling. And primary schooling in the city of Bristol, where I currently am. And I'm hoping to put together a really multi-layered analysis of educational injustices as they exist in Bristol's primary schools, but also over time, using oral histories and archival research, and use that really rich empirical base to build a public conversation, not just in the city, but nationally, and I hope connected to sort of international debates, as we've seen in the UNESCO report, to what we're going to do about it, to how we can bring reparative frameworks into our thinking for addressing the class, and particularly class and racial inequalities that we're seeing. And this cuts across the epistemic, if we're thinking about decolonising the curriculum and sort of the need for epistemic repair in primary schools. It cuts across the material aspects, the actual, the political economy of funding, that we see stark divides. And in terms, actually, that links to curriculum, because it's often the first thing to go is curricular diversity in these schools. The provision of so-called extras that are, I would argue, are central, particularly to primary schooling. And one of the things that I think is going to be really exciting as part of the project is that last point, experiments in reparative practice. I'm hoping to design with others, and certainly it's a very participatory project, so I've got fantastic partnerships with community organisations and schools and so on, to actually develop workshops to how to have these really difficult conversations with people who are differently positioned, who do not always agree. One of the things about reparative justice is that we're going to come at this question in really very different ways, and we're not going to agree. In fact, I can guarantee you we will not all agree, but arguably we all have to do something to make a better education for tomorrow's children. So that's a really difficult conversation. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I am going to try. And so I would love, in the Q&As, if people have questions or thoughts, ideas to take forward, that would be really, really fantastic. So that was my way of conclusion, to say that actually this is not a conclusion, but the very start of what I hope will be big. And in fact, what I think this is probably a bit too grand, but I'm hoping it will open out a new field of inquiry, reparative studies in education, something that does challenge the determinism that I named earlier. So I'll leave it there. The reference list is there, so I'll maybe perhaps leave that up for a second. But if we could have some conversation, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you.